Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 79. The Kids Aren't All Right. Izuku had been using Saturdays to haul as much scrap to the scrapyard as he could. He had found a mostly functional dolly and fixed it up so that he could take as much as possible. Identifying metals on site was becoming another oddly specific skill in his arsenal. Aluminum and steel were abundant but didn't pay much, and copper and iron were rare and paid handsomely. He did his best to save every bit of iron or copper scraps he could find, but usually he wasn't lucky enough to find any. There was one day when he found a bunch of broken and bent pieces of a wrought iron fence, though. He slept well that night. Hauling that crap was the most intensive workout he'd ever endured, and All Might kept asking him the next day if he was all right. He was not. He was in immense pain, but he made nearly 30,000 yen, so it was worth it. One gloriously sweltering early June afternoon, Izuku stumbled upon a veritable gold mine. Or a copper mine would be a more accurate term. He was sifting through a pile of rubbish like he always was when he saw the beautiful green patinaed orange shine that he kept a keen eye out for at all times. He batted away the stuff trapping the copper piping to reveal more and more of it. He couldn't believe his eyes. The pipes were mangled, but the one he found had to be at least 20 feet long. There were several of them joined together but bent and crushed at various points, but that didn't matter, not to the scrapyard. Forgetting that he wasn't alone, he let out a triumphant laugh as he yanked the pipes out one by one. He froze when All Might's booming voice called out to him from below. Toshinori had been supervising Midoriya as he worked for the 7th Sunday in a row now. He was proud that the boy hadn't given up yet, but he was learning that Midoriya was never one to back down from a challenge. He worked with a ferocity that he's not sure he could have kept up with in his prime, not without One for All. The project was progressing faster than he had planned, and he was presently working on an altered schedule that involved working on the kids' fighting skills. After all, being a hero wasn't all about strength. He glanced up to make sure that Midoriya was all right every so often and kept his ears perked up for any sounds of distress, even though the boy had proven himself more than capable enough to bounce around the tops of the trash mounds. Midoriya was always so quiet in both his movements and voice, so Toshinori made sure that he was listening intently at all times. Because of the usual silence, he actually startled slightly before a smile found its way across his face when a bark of joyous laughter echoed across the beach. He's not sure he'd ever heard the boy laugh before. It was nice. "What did you find, my boy?" Toshinori asked with a smile as he walked over. Midoriya froze like a kid caught with their hand in the cookie jar. Damn it, why'd he have to ruin it? "Oh, it's nothing. It's just some pipes," he replied. "What's so exciting about pipes?" he asked, hoping to spark whatever joy he'd accidentally scared out of him. They're copper pipes?" he clarified. "Yes, it looks like they are," he said, glancing at the pile of them that had been accumulated. Why was he excited about copper pipes? Should he ask, or was that just going to make him more uncomfortable? Trying to get to know Midoriya was proving to be more of a challenge than he'd anticipated, but keeping mum wasn't getting him anywhere. "What's so exciting about copper pipes, then?" he amended his question. Midoriya started picking at his nail beds as he stumbled through a response. Well, copper is... Different metals go for different amounts, but copper is pretty high up there with iron, so I could probably get at the scrapyard. I mean, they buy scrap metals to recycle, and copper is one of the more valuable ones. "Ah, you're going to sell it?" he asked, because honestly, the explanation wasn't very clear. "How entrepreneurial." Um, yes, he responded with a guilty look. Why did he look like he was being scolded? It was going to take him decades to understand the boy at this rate. That's quite a lot of metal. How are you going to get it all there? He pressed on, trying desperately to have a normal conversation without feeling like he screwed up somehow. Yeah, Midoriya huffed out a laugh that seemed genuine, but Toshinori couldn't say for sure. It is a lot, he trailed off. Does it matter if it's all bent up like that? No, I think they just melt it down in a foundry. They don't care about how beat up it is. They just weigh it and price it off that, he explained. All right, this was going better. Well, then, why don't I bend it down for you? It should fit in my truck if we do that. How far is the scrapyard? Somehow, all the color drained from Midoriya's incredibly red and sweaty face at the offer. No, you don't have to do that. It's fine. I can. I couldn't ask you to. You're not asking me to, my boy. Some of these pieces are too long to even fit in my truck. How else are you planning on getting them to the yard? Can cut them up. You don't need. That would take far too long. He dismissed, already bending the largest pipe in a zigzag pattern. Keep picking them out, young Midoriya. I'm not helping you with that part, he said, hoping to frighten the fight out of him. He wasn't sure whether he should be happy or sad that it worked. The boy went back to sorting through the pile without another word of complaint. Every so often, he would gently toss another pipe into a pile about 10 feet to Toshinori's right, and he would bend it down if it was too long to fit in his truck bed. Midoriya spent half of his lunch break hauling the pipes over to his car before Toshinori chastised him for not eating. He scurried off after that, presumably to pick up lunch wherever he went to pick up lunch every Sunday. While he was gone, Toshinori scooped up the remaining scrap and dumped it into the truck in one trip. That boy worked himself too hard. They might need to have a talk about that. Izuku scurried off and contemplated stealing a sandwich from the convenience store like he did most Sundays, but he decided against it. His stomach was too tied up in knots to be hungry right now. All Might made him nervous. He didn't know how to act around him, but he got the feeling that whatever he was doing was wrong. He didn't speak unless spoken to, like adults usually wanted, but All Might didn't speak much either. He was a quiet man, which Izuku would not have guessed based on his public persona, but it was a bit presumptuous to think he'd always be so lively. Maybe he was like Shinso-san. Maybe he actually wanted to talk to Izuku? No, he knew he was a null. Why would he want to talk to him? But again, why would he choose him to be his successor if he knew he was a null? Izuku had been asking himself that for the last month and a half, and he'd yet to come up with an answer. This whole situation was incredibly confusing. All Might was incredibly confusing. Why was he so nice? What did he see in him? Why him? Why him? Why him? He had a feeling he would never find the answer to that question, and most of the time he convinced himself that it didn't matter why All Might chose him. But now the question came back with a vengeance. He was helping Izuku for no good reason. If anything, he should be telling him off for wasting time. Sorting metals by type wasn't necessary to recycle them, yet here he was helping Izuku. It didn't make any sense. Izuku looked liable to burst into tears when he came back to see the rest of the pipes had been packed into the truck already. Toshinori did his best to dismiss him. It really wasn't an issue. It took him less than 2 minutes, and he tried to tell the boy that, but he doubted that he even heard him through the endless font of "thank yous" he was spouting. He worked even more diligently for the rest of the day. It got to the point where Toshinori actually had to step in to make sure he was taking breaks to drink and breathe. He abandoned the schedule alterations he'd been passively working on in order to keep a better eye on the kid. He was liable to get heat stroke working in the sun like this. He was wearing long sleeves and full-length pants as well, which surely wasn't helping, but he figured it probably saved the kid from an innumerable amount of cuts and scrapes, so he didn't comment. He just made sure he stayed hydrated. As the day wound down, he ushered the boy to the truck filled to the brim with pipes and had him help strap it down with some fishing net they'd picked up and the few ratchet straps he had lying around the cab. The pipes were already a tangled mess, so they were unlikely to slip out, but he'd rather be safe than sorry. He had to clear some junk out of the passenger seat so that Midoriya had somewhere to sit, but it didn't take long. Thank you for this all night. You really didn't have to. He thanked him for probably the 50th time since he came back from lunch, once he got settled in his seat. Well, how else are you going to get them there, my boy? I have a cart thing, he supplied awkwardly. You are going to walk all of this 8 kilometers away? Toshinori asked incredulously. Yeah? That would have taken all day. When would you have had time for that? I have free time on Saturdays, he supplied weakly. They're open late on Saturdays. Saturday? But that was his recovery day. He was meant to be resting. Why did he know the scrapyard was open late on Saturdays? Have you been going there on Saturdays? He asked. Yes. Saturdays are your break days, my boy, he reminded him. I know, Midoriya replied, sounding a bit confused. Have you not been resting? You need to rest, he reminded him again. I do. I rest, he tried to insist. Young Midoriya, I made that schedule for a reason. If you overdo things, it's going to have the opposite effect of what we want. He chastised a little harsher than he'd meant to. The effect was immediate. Midoriya let out a quiet, I'm sorry, All Might, before he withdrew into himself completely. The small boy made himself impossibly smaller as he stilled any fidgeting he had been doing, and he looked down to his lap. He was completely silent and still, save for the slight trembling of his hands. Toshinori brought his hand up to scrub at his face. He didn't miss the way Midoriya flinched from him, and everything clicked after that. Toshinori remembered the way people used to act around him when he was quirkless. They either treated him like he was made of glass or just a waste of space. There were very few quirked individuals who treated him with respect, and he could imagine the same was true of Midoriya. He remembered how he felt when Nana chose him to be her successor. He hadn't felt worthy. He had spent his whole career proving his worth not only to himself but to the world. Midoriya wasn't nearly so distanced. He was still living that reality. It's all right, my boy. You need to rest. Resting is equally important as working. If you don't give your muscles time to repair themselves, they aren't going to heal stronger. They aren't going to heal at all, he explained gently. Midoriya just nodded his head and kept his eyes glued to his lap. Before I got One for All, I was quirkless too, he admitted. Midoriya whipped his head up and looked at him in shock. He kept moving his mouth like he was going to speak, but he didn't say anything. He furrowed his brow and chewed on his lip as he settled his gaze back to his lap. You don't need to prove yourself to me any more than you already have, my boy, he finished before he stuck the key into the ignition and headed for the scrapyard. The drive was quiet, save for the low hum of the radio, and Toshinori could see Midoriya in his periphery scrub at his eyes periodically like he was wiping away tears. He wasn't sure if that was the right thing to say, but it was too late now. What was done was done. When they got to the scrapyard, Toshinori stayed in the car and let Midoriya pile everything into a cart and bring it over to the teller himself. He sat there and waited as the boy dealt with the transaction on his own. He seemed far more comfortable doing things on his own, and Toshinori wasn't sure how to feel about that. He saw too much of himself in that boy. It only took about 15 minutes for him to quietly settle back into the passenger seat, but he apologized for the delay anyway and thanked him 2 more times before he even got his seatbelt buckled. Let's set up a pile for things to bring to the scrapyard throughout the week, and we can take a load over on Sundays. I know I don't have to, Toshinori interrupted before Midoriya could start. I want to. You need rest days. If you're going to do this, I'd rather it be within the parameters of our schedule. You're already progressing faster than I'd anticipated, so you don't need to worry about falling behind. He was looking up at him like he wanted to argue, but he didn't say anything. He just nodded and turned his focus back down to his lap again. He's not sure if he actually got through to the boy or if he was just too scared to argue any further. He hoped it was the former, but he highly doubted it. Let me take you home, All Might said after he informed Izuku he wasn't allowed to work on Saturdays anymore. He hoped that he was able to keep the way his heart dropped to his stomach off his face. He immediately went to refuse, but he stopped himself. All Might was getting fed up with him refusing help, and he didn't want him to be any more mad at him than he already was. Thinking as quickly as he could, he rattled off the address of his old apartment. Thankfully, All Might didn't question his hesitance. He just started up the car and drove out of the lot. The drive was quiet, as Izuku was lost in thought. He couldn't wrap his brain around All Might being quirkless. At least it made more sense why he picked Izuku of all people. He didn't know how to feel about it. He wanted to be happy. He wanted to be able to see himself living up to All Might's reputation, but he couldn't. He just felt angry that he couldn't, but he couldn't figure out why. He wasn't mad at All Might, nor himself, at least not any more than he usually was. He didn't even know what he was mad at, much less why. He was shaken out of his thoughts by the truck coming to a stop in front of a familiar building. For the second time in the same drive, he felt his heart drop to his stomach, and he did his best to keep it off his face. He hadn't thought through this plan enough to realize he was going to have to see the building again. He hadn't seen it in 3 years. He had made a point to not look back when he left. This had been his home for his whole life. It was all he knew. He knew it was going to be too much for him to look back at this place with the knowledge that he was no longer allowed in his home. He had tried to protect himself from that, but, well, apparently he couldn't hide forever. Feigning nonchalance as best he could, he bid All Might farewell. He left and shut the car door behind himself before walking toward the front door of the apartment complex. He walked slowly, waiting for the sound of tires rolling away to tell him that All Might had left, but they never came. Izuku had made it all the way to the door, and he was still there. He turned around and waved, but still, All Might sat there, waiting. Kami, this was awkward. Turning back to the door, he hoped that they hadn't fixed it in the 3 years since he'd been gone. He jiggled the handle just so and yanked on the door, and sure enough, it opened right up without a key. Seeing the foyer only made it worse. The floor had all the same scuffs he remembered, and the elevator still held the same out-of-order sign it always had. But the mailbox that had once read Midoriya had a stranger's name on it. He forced himself to stand there outside of the view of the windows for as long as he could bear to before he peeked out to check that the truck had driven away. Thankfully, it was nowhere to be seen, so Izuku wrenched open the door and ran faster than he had in a long, long time. He let the rapidly cooling summer night breeze flow through his hair, and he didn't stop until he was back in Uptown. That wasn't his home anymore. He let himself catch his breath as he walked back to the brewery. By the time he'd finally made his way back to the office, he only had about a half hour before he needed to head out for patrol. He couldn't bring himself to do anything. He just sat on the couch, stared at the wall till he had to start getting ready. Kami, this was going to be a long night. End of chapter.